Hello and welcome to another An Old Man Watches. And today we're going to be talking about Creature from the Haunted Sea, made in 1959 actually, but released in 1961, and produced and directed by one Roger Corman, a famously tight-fisted filmmaker, which will be an important part of what we discuss when we talk about what there is about this movie. But let's start with plot. So basically what this movie is about is a pretty inept secret agent codenamed XK150 who manages to get aboard a ship leaving Cuba with members of the previous regime who are trying to get away with some gold. They end up in a supposedly cursed part of the ocean, and ultimately a monster attacks them. It's all fairly straightforward. It's all fairly simple in terms of it, But basically, you've got a bunch of not terribly nice people, all of whom have reasons to betray one another, and therefore point fingers when people start going missing and assume anything other than a monster being around. While the monster snacks on a few of them. Despite the fact that it's a monster movie, it features an inept secret agent, and it's played for laughs in large part, and that's another thing that we're going to be talking about today. But let's get into the three things that I think are most notable, most interesting to take away from Creature from the Haunted Sea. So number one, oh my goodness, this movie is peak Corman. So I've mentioned that Corman was a notoriously tight-fisted filmmaker. He was all about save as much money up front as possible, because then the movie, whatever the movie makes, it will make money. His biography, his autobiography is, I made over 100 movies in Hollywood and never lost a dime. There's a probably apocryphal story where they were shooting one of his movies. They filmed a scene, and somebody said to him, was that okay? And he said, if the camera didn't fall over, it's all good. But that is probably a slight exaggeration. And I should call out, Corman was he gave first opportunities to people like Francis Ford Coppola and James Cameron. This is a guy with a real eye for talent. He worked with Jack Nicholson very early on in Jack Nicholson's career. This is a guy with an eye for talent, but a huge focus on the monetary aspect of making movies, and particularly on saving costs. And that is important to this movie, and this is why this is a peak Corman kind of film, because in 1959, Corman took his production company to Puerto Rico to film 2 movies. And at the end of that process, he was like, we've got lots of footage that we shot that we're not using for either of these films. We can't let that go to waste. So he grabbed a script that he'd already filmed. He had writer Charles B. Griffin, who is credited on a whole bunch of his projects, rewrite it slightly, change the location so it'll fit the footage and locations that they already had, make it a bit of a spy horror spoof instead of a straight-up horror movie, because it was originally filmed as a horror film. And then they spent 5 days filming some extra material to scrape together this movie. 5 days is not the shortest amount of time that Corman ever spent filming a film. We'll get to that film sometime in the future. But yeah, basically they took a bunch of film footage that had been filmed for 2 completely different other films. They spent 5 days filming some extra stuff. They rewrote an existing script, stuck it all together, and re-released it as a new project. The reused script that formed this film's base was called The Beast from Haunted Cave. So that's the kind of level of edit. The Beast from Haunted Cave became The Creature from the Haunted Sea. This is peak Corman. This is a great example of Corman's approach to filmmaking. It's also worth noting that the soundtrack of this film is also recycled. This exact score is used in no less than 7 of Roger Corman's movies, though apparently that's the case. That's apparently a case of the composer putting one over Corman rather than Corman being cheap. Corman paid for new music. The composer was just like, you don't actually care or notice, I'm going to give you exactly the same stuff and you're going to pay me. So, what goes around comes around, I guess. But yeah, this is peak Corman. It's a great example of his approach to filmmaking from a behind-the-scenes perspective, which, honestly, is probably more interesting than the movie that actually ends up on screen. The second thing to talk about, though, and again, it's related to Corman's kind of approach to filmmaking, and I've called it room to move, and you'll see why, I guess, at the end of what I'm talking about, is Corman was a great believer in not having long static dialogue scenes. He hated long scenes where a bunch of people are just standing around talking, and he's like, we need to do something to put some action on the screen, to create some movement, to create some motion. And so in this movie, where there's one long scene where a bunch of guys are standing around talking to one another, Corman was like, well, we're shooting this scene in a palm grove, so let's play some football while these characters, with a coconut as the ball, while these characters are having this conversation. That has nothing to do with the game that they're playing, but it puts some movement on screen and it will be less boring to audiences. Now, the reason I've called this room to move is that anyone who has watched the infamously bad film The Room by Tommy Wiseau will remember that there are a couple of times in that movie where where a bunch of guys get together and throw around a football and have conversations that have nothing to do with that. And I have to wonder, is Tommy Wiseau a fan of this movie? Possibly the only fan of this movie? It's just an interesting thought. Is this something that Tommy Wiseau picked up on? Who knows? But it's to me, it's hard not to imagine there's a connection. The third thing that I want to discuss is misleading advertising. Because if you look at the poster there, what was the unspeakable secret of the sea of lost ships? Please do not give away the answer to the secret. Big monster grabbing a girl who's scantily clad, ship sinking. There's nothing about that advertising that suggests that this is a comedy. And that almost certainly created something of a cognitive dissonance in audiences when, they sit down to watch the movie, and number one, they get a crazy animated credit sequence, which is possibly the best thing about the film, frankly. And at the end, the monster turns out to basically be a wetsuit covered in scouring pads and ping pong balls. It's a very silly take on a horror script. Deliberately silly, but nothing about the advertising for the film conveys that. I don't know what the reasoning behind the misleading advertising campaign was. It being Corman, I wouldn't put it past. I commissioned the poster before I actually knew what the rewritten script the rewritten script would be a comedy, and I'm not going to throw away the money we spent on it. Maybe they just felt like horror movies were more popular at the time, and therefore it was more likely to make bank that way. And remember, all Corman cared about was making back his money, and a little bit extra. I don't know why they went down that route, but they did. And the consensus is it probably hurt the film, because at the end of the day, the people who did see it were disappointed, and therefore word of mouth was bad. It's not the movie it looks like it's going to be. But yeah, so there were three kind of features of Creature from the Haunted Sea that I wanted to discuss. It's pretty easy to find a copy of this around online, I think, should you wish to do so. A few of Corman's films have kind of fallen into the public domain, and if not that, it's certainly available in a whole bunch of those kind of like cheapy collections of movies that used to be popular 20 years ago, where you got a big box set of cheap DVDs. So, what are we going to talk about next time, having discussed The Creature from the Haunted Sea? Well, we're going to come forward a little bit to a straight-up kind of horror movie, and that horror movie is Near Dark, Catherine Bigelow film, who obviously went on to some critical success. She's won a couple of Academy Awards. So this is from 1987. The tagline is "Pray for Daylight" because it's a vampire movie. So we'll be talking about my thoughts on this film, what's interesting about it, what's disappointing about it, that sort of thing, next time. In the meantime, thanks for watching this one. Hope you enjoyed it, and catch you next time for Near Dark.